In this video, we're talking about a certain group of consonants called plosives, and also called stops. All right, and those words are used interchangeably. So if you want to call these sounds a stop in terms of its manner of articulation or a plosive, it's up to you. Either one is good. But the important characteristics for English are those, or the defining ones for English are in particular 6 plosives. Although we also produce something that's called a glottal stop. And these have different ways to define them, but all these sounds are including p, t, k, g, and t and d. And also the glottal stop, which is sort of optional in certain things that we say, but that's sort of the sound right where in the middle of 2 vowels and o, where we sort of slam our vocal folds shut and stop the sound for a brief second there. All right, but b, p, t, d, and k and g are the 6 that we're going to focus on right now, just to introduce you to the concept of a stop. And they have differing ways of being distinguished that we're going to go through. We're going to talk about place of articulation, force of articulation, whether they are voiced or not. And again, that means whether your vocal folds are vibrating while you're producing the sound. And we're going to talk about aspiration a little bit later when we get to allophones, but some of these sounds are produced with a little puff of air or the length of the preceding vowel. All right, we're going to see what effect these sounds have on the sounds around them. All right, first of all, we're going to start with the basics, place of articulation, which by now you're familiar with the IPA chart, so this should be fairly easy for you to match up. All right, so the sounds here, p and b, are both bilabial, meaning that they're made with both lips. You have your upper lip and your lower lip meeting at a certain point. So we call those bilabial sounds. T and d are usually made with the part of the tongue, usually the tip or blade, against the alveolar ridge. So we call those alveolars. And then finally we have k and g that are velar sounds because you've got that part of the tongue, usually the body of the tongue, held against the velum when you make those sounds. All right, a little bit new, though, we'll be considering whether the sounds are so-called fortis or lenis, or you can think of them as strong, and that would be fortis, or weak sounds. And this is getting a little bit more into the detail of how these sounds are produced in English. Fortis, or strong sounds, are produced with a lot of muscular effort. So you can think of them in a way as similar to those tense vowels that we talked about earlier. So they have more muscular effort. There's more airflow going on while they are produced. And they often last longer. They're a little bit longer sounds than the lenis, or the weak group. So the weak would just be sort of the opposite. Less muscular effort, less airflow, and a little bit shorter duration of the sound. All right, so if we were to consider which sounds go in what group, it's fairly simple. Our strong sounds are p, t, and k, and our weak sounds are b, d, and g. And they're going to be similar to another aspect of these sounds that we're going to think about. Which is its voicing. So whether our vocal folds are vibrating or not while we're producing these sounds. And you can probably sit there right now and make the sounds and have your fingers in the area of your larynx and figure out for yourself which ones are voiced or voiceless. If you say pa, ta, ka, if you try and say them without a little vowel, that little schwa after, you won't feel anything happen. But if you say b, d, g, or it's really hard to do those without any vowel action afterwards. But there you can feel more voicing happening. All right, so it happens to work out that we've got those two groups, voiced or voiceless, so that since I list voiced here on top, I'll start with that. Our voiced sounds are b, d, and g, and our voiceless sounds are p, t, and k. And that's a relatively simplified way of thinking about how they work in English. We'll get a little bit more detail. But our voiceless sounds, p, t, and k, are pretty much always voiceless. The voiced ones, it's a little bit more like the Facebook status. It's complicated, but we'll get to that later in the class. All right, we're going to skip over aspiration until we get into more detail on sounds and talk about allophones. But for now, we can talk about what's happening when you add on a different sound at the end. Just looking at this, you have C, and there's no stop in that sound, or word, I should say. There's nothing, but you notice at the end of these two words, seed and seat, there are two different stops. This one ends with the duh, and this one ends with a tuh. All right, and if we compare how long all these vowels, as a refresher, to our vowel discussion, hopefully you recognize that these all involve the vowel E. All right, so we've got C, and then we got seed, and here we have seat, and they just all happen to be preceded with a sound which is written as fairly simple. But if I try not to say them so carefully and I just say them relaxed normally, see, seed, and seat, you'll notice even though they all involve the same vowel, the same, as we learned before, high front, tense, it's also a long vowel of English, but all of them are a little bit different. The vowel E gets progressively shorter as we go through each of those words. And why that happens is because the last one we say is with this fortis consonant at the end here, t. And we talked about those being longer sounds before. And to compensate, we change the length of a vowel that might be around there. So in that word seat, the E tends to be shorter than seed, or especially C, with there's nothing after that vowel at all. That'll be the longest. So here we're going in terms of just how long that vowel lasts, all the way from long to short. So just remember that if you have a fortis consonant, any vowel in front of it is going to be a little bit shorter than if it were in front of a lenis consonant. Okay, so now we're getting into more detail about how these sounds are produced. More than just the place and the manner. It's a little bit more complicated to talk about how these vowels are produced. And we're going to focus on the 6 phonemic consonants, plosive consonants of English. And we won't talk much about the glottal stop at this moment. And when we're talking about sounds right now, we're going to tend to write them between slashes like this, because we're really just talking about phonemes. When we get into more details and talking about allophones, we can start to write things this way, but that'll be towards the latter half of the course. All right, first of all, to consider what's going on with plosives, we have to think of what's happening. Right? There's a lot going on. First, you have some things that are going to be closed off, because we talked about sounds that could be prolonged, and in the plosive, it's this part where things are cut off. This is sort of the stop part of the name of a stop consonant. You can keep that closure and kind of hold that out long, optionally, if you wanted to. And I'm going to try and show you what I mean here with one of the articulation videos. You may want to study this in more detail on your own. All right, here we've got to the stop portion where I've hit paused. This is duh, our voiced alveolar plosive. And right now I just want you to focus on what the tongue's doing. The tongue is up against the alveolar ridge and airflow is cut off. All right, but before that, when I show this a second time, see what happens before we get to this point. And again, I was too slow on the gun to stop it, to pause it at the right place. But before that, you notice the tongue has to reach up there. Again, too slow. All right, I got it right before the tongue does anything. The tongue is sort of in a neutral position. And then when we go to make a duh sound, wherever our tongue might be in our mouth, it's going to have to reach up to that alveolar ridge, where we get to this portion. Okay? So moving between those stages is, one is the shutting phase, where if we're talking about ta, duh, ka, or ga, the tongue has to reach somewhere and shut off the airflow. Or we can also think of our lips, as in pa and ba. The lips have to come together, and then for a certain period of time, that closure is held, and then we have to release that closure. We're not going to cut off the airflow forever, because then we couldn't breathe and we die. All right, so if I keep this going, right now I'm in the sort of the closure phase of the stop. If I hit play again, we'll see the release. Okay. So those are the three phases. Other things I want you to notice while you watch these videos is what's going on with the velum. We'll talk through that for each of these sounds, but for all of these sounds, the velum has to raise up and keep air from going out the nose. These are not nasal sounds. It's not like or Right? All the sounds should be coming out of the mouth. So that velum is raising, and you can see whether or not the vocal folds are vibrating in these videos too. It's going to kind of look like a rubber band twanging here. We've got a voice sound here, so if I let this play, you'll notice it move. Okay, so all plosives have these three components or stages to them. And so our first sound here is our, let me get my pen. Is in terms of our descriptions for sounds, is our voiceless, bilabial, plosive. All right, I'm just going to write P here because these are all plosives. All right, so you'll notice in all of these sounds, a lot of the same stuff is going on. All right, for all of these, the soft palate or the velum has to be raised because airflow is not going through the nose. But for this sound, the sound is made with the lips. All right, and this happens to be a voiceless sound, so the vocal folds are not vibrating. And what happens is at a certain point we got that closure. And when we do that, airflow is not moving anywhere. So there's a little bit of air pressure building up. And when that's released, then the air goes rushing out and escapes, and you get that sort of puff of air, that aspiration that we'll talk about more later. But if you just try it, puh, puh, with your hand in front of your mouth, you can feel that little puff of air. All right, so that is our first stop in English we're going to talk about. All right, this next sound is almost exactly the same. The one difference is that the vocal folds are vibrating during it. And this is our voiced bilabial plosive. All right, so when I give you that symbol, think voiced bilabial plosive and think of the sound buh. All right, the next sound, things get a little bit more complicated. Once you don't have to just think about the lip, we're going to think about what the tongue is doing. All right, so the rest of our sounds have the tongue moving somewhere in the mouth. And our first sound here is our voiceless alveolar plosive, t. This is t. All right, so it's alveolar, and that means that the tongue tip or the tongue blade, we usually consider it an apical sound, pretty much using the tip, is making contact with that alveolar ridge during the closure portion. But you'll notice a lot of the same features are the same. And unlike this kitty, your tongue tip should be up here behind the teeth. But you're going to have the same thing. You're going to have that closure phase where airflow is cut off and a little bit of air pressure builds up in the oral cavity. And when you release that t, you can feel a little bit of a puff of air as the air rushes out. If we move on to duh, it's the same thing as t, except that the voice, the vocal folds is going. So we've got a voiced alveolar plosive with vocal fold vibration. Okay, finally we have our last two English plosives. We got k, the first of the two we're going to talk about, with which is a voiceless velar plosive, and it is produced without the vocal folds vibrating and with that tongue back or the tongue body making a closure with the velum. So it's hitting up against the velum. And that one I think is worth showing because it's a little bit trickier to visualize what's going on, especially if you wanted to view yourself in a mirror, because all the action is towards the back of the mouth. All right, so that's our voiceless velar plosive there. All right, so this part of the tongue is meeting up with the velum, but at the same time that velum is raised, so no air can get out through the nose. This passageway is blocked off. And then there's going to be some oral pressure building up there behind this closure. Once that's released, you get a little puff of air. And you'll also notice in this video, the vocal folds aren't doing anything. This is a voiceless sound. All right, so that's our voiceless velar plosive. Our last sound is our voiced velar plosive, which is produced just like k, except with some vocal fold vibration in that sound. So this is our g, a voiced velar plosive. All right, now let me know, remember to do your warm-up and let me know what you are curious about or what you are struggling with these particular sounds. Good luck.